I walked into the police station. I was 14. I told them everything, the names, the cars, what they did to me. The officer looked at me and he told me to go home and sober up. As I walked out the door, another car pulled up and I knew no one was coming to save me.
For decades, this wasn't just one child's story. It was the story of thousands across Britain. It's a horrifying truth, one that was systematically buried by the very institutions that were supposed to protect them. Cases in Rotherham, Rochdale, and Telford finally exposed a national scandal of organized child sexual exploitation that was allowed to fester for years. We learned of at least 1,400 girls abused in Rotherham and over 1,000 children in Telford. But beyond the headlines of these notorious cases lie countless other stories, untold stories of betrayal, of silenced victims, and of a deliberate systemic failure that stretches right into the present day. These are not just stories of the past. They're the stories of survivors still fighting for justice, of perpetrators who were never held to account, and of a political and social establishment that for years simply chose to look the other way. This is the story of how the protectors became complicit, and how a generation of children paid the price for their silence. The fight to expose this truth is far from over. The pattern is sickeningly familiar, repeated in towns and cities all over the country. It doesn't begin with violence, but with a slow, insidious kindness. The perpetrators don't look like monsters at first. They offer a gift, a ride, a compliment, or just attention to a girl who feels invisible. They target the vulnerable, girls in care homes, those from broken families, or simply those struggling with the universal insecurities of being a teenager. One survivor, known as Elizabeth, recalled how her abuse was made possible by a woman to begin with, a trusted face that lowered her guard before she was trafficked and abused by gangs of men. For these girls, the attention feels like affection. The gifts feel like love. The perpetrators build a world around their victims, cutting them off from friends and family, and creating a toxic dependency. They offer alcohol and drugs, first as a treat, then as a tool of control. A debt is created that can only be repaid in one way. Soon, the mask slips. The boyfriend shares her with his friends. The car rides become terrifying journeys to squalid flats, alleyways, and warehouses, where unspeakable acts are committed by multiple men. The abuse becomes, as one survivor put it, normalized. It becomes a part of daily life, a horrifying routine from which there seems to be no escape. The victims are trapped, not just by physical threats, but by a deep sense of shame and the twisted belief that they are somehow to blame. They're told no one will believe them, and for decades, the perpetrators were right. The story of a survivor named Chantel shows just how long and hard the road to justice really is. For years she waited for action, knowing her abusers were still at large, while authorities moved at a glacial pace. Another survivor, Jade, experienced the ultimate betrayal. After enduring horrific abuse, she was the one who was prosecuted and sent to jail, criminalized by the very system that should have saved her. These aren't just isolated anecdotes. They are emblematic of a nationwide strategy of exploitation. The gangs operated with a chilling confidence, born from the knowledge that the systems designed to stop them were fundamentally broken. They picked up girls from care homes in broad daylight. They operated for years, sometimes decades, in the same towns, using the same methods, targeting generation after generation of vulnerable girls, all while the authorities who were paid to protect them did nothing. So why did no one act? How could a scandal of this magnitude remain a so-called dark secret for so long? The answer is a toxic mix of incompetence, victim blaming, and a paralyzing fear within institutions of being labeled racist. Time and again, when victims found the courage to speak out, they were met with disbelief and dismissal. They were told they were imagining it, that they were liars, or worse, that they were consenting. The recent 2025 audit by Baroness Casey concluded that too many cases have been dropped or downgraded from rape because of a perception that victims aged 13 to 15 had consented. The law was twisted to protect abusers, not children. Social services departments were often overwhelmed and under-resourced. But there was something more sinister at play. Reports were filed and then lost. Warnings from youth workers were ignored. In some cases, the institutional failure went beyond mere neglect and crossed into active complicity. For years, there have been allegations of police misconduct in Rotherham, with investigations into claims that officers had also raped child victims. For these victims, there was truly nowhere to turn. The very people they ran to for help were in some cases part of the nightmare. But perhaps the most pervasive reason for the decades of inaction was a cultural paralysis. In many of the high-profile cases, like Rotherham, Rochdale, and Keighley, the perpetrators were predominantly of British Pakistani heritage, and authorities, from local councils to police forces, were terrified of being accused of racism if they investigated these communities. This fear created a culture of silence, where raising concerns about the ethnicity of perpetrators was seen as a greater sin than ignoring the rape of children. One Times journalist who was instrumental in exposing the Rotherham scandal, Andrew Norfolk, recalled being labeled a racist for simply pursuing the story. This political correctness became a shield for the perpetrators. They knew officials would shy away from tackling the problem. The 2025 Casey audit highlighted this, finding that while there were many reasons for poor data collection, authorities sometimes avoided acting on or even recording ethnicity data, partly out of fear of the backlash. This reluctance to confront an uncomfortable truth had a devastating consequence. It put the reputation of institutions ahead of the lives of children. It was a moral failure of catastrophic proportions, a stain on our society that allowed the abuse to continue, unchecked, for decades. The horrors of Rotherham, where an estimated 1,400 children were abused, were not an anomaly. They were the tip of a terrifying iceberg. What happened there, and in Rochdale, Telford, Oxford, and dozens of other places, was not a series of isolated failings, but a deeply embedded, national pattern of institutional decay. The 2022 Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, led by Professor Alexis J., concluded after 8 years that police and councils across the country had downplayed the scale of the problem for years. The NSPCC estimates that 1 in 20 UK children has experienced sexual abuse, a horrifying statistic that gives context to just how widespread vulnerability is in our society. While group-based exploitation is a smaller part of this total, its organized nature makes it a uniquely insidious threat. In 2023 alone, police recorded approximately 700 offenses related to group-based child sexual exploitation, a figure that experts believe drastically underestimates the true number. The debate around this issue has been fraught, and at times, deliberately distorted. For years, the conversation has been polarized. On one hand, Some have pointed to the ethnicity of perpetrators in specific, high-profile cases, arguing that political correctness was the primary cause of the systemic failures. On the other, many have warned that focusing on ethnicity creates a dangerous moral panic that stigmatizes entire communities and distracts from the universal problem of child abuse. The data itself has been a battleground. Baroness Casey's 2025 audit found that in areas with high-profile cases, like Greater Manchester and South Yorkshire, men of Pakistani heritage were disproportionately represented among suspects. However, the same report slammed the national data collection as completely inadequate, with ethnicity data missing in 2/3 of cases, making it impossible to draw firm conclusions at a national level. In fact, a 2020 Home Office report found no credible evidence that any single ethnic group was disproportionately responsible for these crimes nationwide. And data from the National Police Chiefs Council has shown that where ethnicity was recorded, the vast majority of suspects in group-based exploitation cases were white. This conflicting data reveals a complex truth. While cultural factors and specific community dynamics can't be ignored in local contexts, trying to frame this as a problem exclusive to one ethnic group is a dangerous oversimplification. The real, unifying thread running through every single one of these cases, from Rotherham to Oxford to Telford, is not the background of the perpetrators, but the consistent and unforgivable failure of British institutions. Police forces, social services, and local councils failed. They failed to listen, they failed to investigate, and they failed to protect. That is the national scandal. For the survivors, justice is a concept that feels distant, almost theoretical. For many, the physical and psychological scars will never fade. One victim described feeling haunted every day, unable to lead a normal life due to the trauma. They live with the consequences of not only the abuse itself, but the profound betrayal by those who were supposed to help. As one survivor from Yorkshire put it, "This is my childhood, and my going into my adulthood, that I'm still suffering." In recent years, there have been signs of movement. A national grooming gangs task force has led to over 550 arrests and identified thousands of victims in its first year. High-profile convictions continue, with perpetrators from historic cases in Rochdale and Rotherham finally being jailed. But for many survivors, it's too little, too late. There is a deep-seated feeling of inquiry fatigue, a sense that reports are published and recommendations are made, only to be shelved as the political will fades. The recent Casey audit laid bare the depth of the institutional failure and made 12 urgent recommendations. These included treating the sexual penetration of a child under 16 as rape in all circumstances, and reviewing the wrongful criminal convictions of victims. In response, the government has announced it will launch a statutory national inquiry, a crucial step. This cannot be just another report left to gather dust. A statutory inquiry has the power to compel witnesses to testify under oath and to demand evidence from police forces and government departments that have hidden behind a wall of silence for too long. It must go beyond the failures of individual towns and investigate the rot at the heart of the system. It must ask why warnings were ignored at the highest levels of government for decades. It must hold to account the senior police officers, council leaders, and officials who presided over this national disgrace. There can be no more excuses, no more cover-ups. The untold stories are not just tales of suffering. They are stories of immense courage and resilience. The survivors who have spoken out have done so at great personal cost, reliving their trauma in the hope of preventing it from happening to others. One survivor, known as Elizabeth, now campaigns to give a voice to the voiceless. Another, known as Erin, put it simply, "I just hope that us survivors We get listened to and not silenced no more. Their demand is not for vengeance, but for truth and accountability. They deserve to know why they were abandoned, and we, as a society, have a moral obligation to ensure that every single stone is unturned, that every failure is exposed, and that every official who was complicit is held responsible. The fight for justice for the thousands of children failed by the state is a fight for the soul of the country. It is a fight that must be won.